Hello, everyone, and welcome to All the Goods Trade Puns Were Taken, our no longer quite bi-weekly show due to busyness and the dearth of trade content, where we try to break down trade news in the most accessible way we can, and hope that you will join us for the ride. With me, I have our intrepid co-hosts. On my virtual left, I have Sam Lowe, the senior researcher at the Center for European Research, CER.
Centre for European Reform.
Reform.
Yeah.
You can't reform Europe. You can just research it endlessly.
Endlessly, yes.
If I understand you correctly. He is also the author of the weekly, if you pay for it, bi-weekly if you don't, Substack, Most Favored Nation, where he accessibly breaks down trade wonkery. Sam, how is that going?
I think it's going quite well. Yes, people seem to enjoy it. This week's edition is predominantly looking at barriers to trade faced by companies wanting to enter the Indian market, with a slight question being put forward by me as to why they think a free trade agreement can deliver the entire economic overhaul of the Indian single market, which I think is probably a little bit too ambitious. But yes, read it and find out. That bit's all outside of the paywall as well. So
it's one of the free editions.
No, I've just lowered the paywall, so that bit's outside of it, but the rest isn't. So you have to pay for that.
It's 2 minutes in. We're doing the introductions, and you're already being sassed in chat, which I think really sets the path for the way forward. With me also is Anna Isaac, the economics editor at The Independent, who has just come out of the budget bunker. How are you hanging in there?
I'm still sort of like slightly in it. I'm a few spreadsheets away from doom, but getting there.
I haven't followed the budget that closely, but I understand the government has spent all of the money, but is sad. Is that the best way to characterize the Chancellor's message?
It's not quite all of the money. It depends how you calculate it. Some people believe in fiscal rules, other people don't. If you're measuring by fiscal rules, he's still left himself some headroom. So it looks like he's looking ahead to maybe some tax cuts before the next election, if GDP holds up, which is a big if just now. So that's the kind of lay of the land.
It's promising and ominous simultaneously somehow, which again, I think really captures the flavor of the moment and the budget. So I wanted to maybe just start off by giving people some background on this episode, and which is all about the concept of trade war, and something we're going to try to do within the hour. As usual, probably going to run out of time, but we'll do our best, is to both talk about the concept of trade wars generally and give people a flavor for kind of what they are, where they fit into the political arsenal of governments, that kind of thing. But then also to talk about the elephant in the room, which is this currently ongoing will they, won't they flirtation that the UK and EU seem to be dancing with the concept of trade war. And this was an episode we sort of thought about, I think, doing a few weeks ago, and when we thought we were going to get a trade war over the Northern Ireland Protocol back then there was a compromise that seemed to be well received, and we sort of went, okay, we don't need to do this anymore, and now we seem to be back to it. So this is our way of doing this episode once, and then we can just point to it every 2 months when a trade war across the English Channel looms. So with that kind of background out of the way, I thought where we could start is actually just a definition of trade war, something that's a little bit more usable than what's out there. And the way I thought we could do that is I'll offer mine and then maybe pass it on to Anna and then Sam, if you guys can just nuance what I've said, add in your bits, because I'll start at a very simplistic level. So my definition of a trade war is when two or more countries, entities that control their own trade policy, decide to look at their arsenal of trade policy tools, and these can be any tools that a government has to impact goods and services coming from another country or headed to another country, and try to use those tools in order to achieve political outcomes and apply pressure to another government or set of governments. So ordinarily, governments are always looking to use trade policy to advantage themselves. That's what they're elected to do, and they do so within certain frameworks. Sometimes those policies they enact will hurt somebody else. They will hurt another government. But that is often the byproduct, if that makes sense. Whereas in a trade war, it's the goal. You set out to go, how can I cause this other government economic and political pain using the trade tools at my disposal? And that's what makes it substantively different from just trying to screw each other in getting investment in or trying to get a good free trade agreement. So that's kind of my working level definition. Anna, do you want to kind of expand on that at all? Throw in anything else? Disagree with me violently?
Definitely don't disagree with you violently. I think that's a really good basis for how this works. I think for me, it's when, because I always have to put what's going on into words in a horribly public way with reporting on these things. It's where do I go with escalation of words? So at a range of publications I've worked for, it's been like, when do you use the word war specifically? Because that is a very big word. It implies a long, intense conflict of some kind. And also, when you use war, where do you go from war? Like once you go to using the word war, all of your language then becomes about weapons. It becomes about things like nuclear options. You struggle to escalate beyond the point of using the word war. So when it came to defining when you could call US-China not a trade spat, not a row, when it had to become war, I think it was when you started to get substantial parts of trade being covered by tit-for-tat tariffs. That's when it started to meet the definition of war, when it became an economically meaningful amount of damage being inflicted, or potentially economically meaningful amount of damage being inflicted by either side using the mechanisms of tit-for-tat tariffs. That was when, and it is a very goods-based way of thinking about it. There's other ways to think about it, like denials of visas, etc., which did start to happen with US-China. But traditionally, that's when I'd start to consider something as a trade war, when you get that tit-for-tat process involved. But there can be some, when there's so much trade, when we're talking about different trade partners like UK, EU, when there's also this strange geography, when you start to have goods not moving, and this did actually happen a bit with US-China, right? There were goods held at ports, etc. When you have trade not moving, when you have a visible physical thing happening, then it's harder to move away, to keep things at the spat level. Then it does become sort of a very visual story, and it can become a trade war quite quickly. But I would generally stick to, if you're going to use war, wait till that point and where countries are hitting one another over the head with reciprocal tariffs. That's for me where it reaches that level.
Sam?
So I struggle with this term slightly in that I think it's been slightly devalued, particularly in the UK debate. So I would say that up until now, the UK has not been at any point in a trade war with the European Union. So even right now, where there is a dispute over fishing, even when there have been spats over whether sausages can enter Northern Ireland or not, never at any one of those points was it a trade war. And my view is that, because I agree with Anna, I think a trade war is the pinnacle almost of descriptive language when it comes to these things. You have to be very careful in applying it. And my view would be that you are in a trade war when, and there's a kind of it when you see it element to it, but when the gloves are completely off, you are using trade tools to cause significant economic harm, and you are doing so outside of any the legal edifice of any treaty, be it the WTO or a bilateral trade agreement. You are no longer bound by a shared set of understandings and rules, because countries get into disputes all the time over dumping around steel, over interpretations of food safety regulation. And this can lead to tariffs, it can lead to retaliation, but no, that's not a trade war. Trade war is when you push all of that aside and just say, I want to cause you pain. And I think we probably got there with Trump and China. in terms of what the actual desired outcome was and how he was using trade policy. But I don't think we've got there between the UK and the EU just yet, and I'm not sure we ever will, or at least I hope not.
I think that this language issue is interesting because there have been a number of the sort of test I apply is, was there a meeting in which people got together, looked at the economy of the other side, and said, here is the change of policy or the political outcome we want. What are the ways we can achieve it? So if you look at, for example, some of the tariffs that the EU applied on the US during the sort of the various back and forward spats when people were throwing around trade war, that wasn't an all-out trade war. But if you look at what the EU targeted, there was a very, there's a pattern there where they said, okay, this is going to hurt people in like the Midwest. This is going to hurt voters in swing states. This will not be entry into final EU products. This is kind of Harley Davidson's. What's iconic? What's going to hurt? So that meeting already, when that meeting is happening, rather than a purely commercial discussion about one side's interests, I think that gets us closer to war. But I think as both Sam, as you both have said, I don't think you're quite there until it really goes gloves off full spectrum. And I 100% agree, the UK and EU have been nowhere, not even in the same continent as a trade war up until now.
Because I'd even say, so with the example you gave of the EU's response to the Trump trade war tariffs, the EU would still arguably claim that the measures it took were consistent with its WTO obligations and were legitimate if you are to consider what Trump did a safeguard, right? So I'm framing this as a question because lots of people disagree with how the EU's framed this, but they would say, and then their approach to the tariffs is actually quite consistent with how countries deal with these sorts of disputes generally. In terms of Boeing Airbus, there was a lot of collateral damage in terms of there were tariffs placed on bourbon, whiskey, cashmere, and that was to achieve a political aim, which was to get those industries annoyed enough to put pressures on their own government to resolve the Boeing Airbus dispute. But even then, I would say, and as you said as well, that's not a trade war. Even with all of that, we're still not quite there yet because there's still at least an attempt to couch it within agreed legal norms.
I don't want to get into... Sorry. Anna, go ahead.
I was just going to say, it's also about escalatory steps, right? So if you're wanting to keep a row fairly niche, you can sort of broaden it out so it includes other bits of the economy, but you're keeping it within certain niches. There might be politically sensitive niches, but you're keeping it in niches. It's when it starts to go to a point of you, as you say, want a certain political outcome that is grander than equalizing trade that you perceive to be unfair, then things start to get escalatory because you're trying to work out at what point of pressure is that, you're finding someone's pain point at a whole different level. I think that's a good tell. I think we could have seen that with the digital services tax had things gone differently at the OECD, for instance. That would have been an example where things could have got pretty nasty pretty fast.
I want to move off this kind of definitional question again to some of the substance, but I did want to, I guess, disagree with Sam a slight bit regarding this test of legally justified. Not because I have any particular strong view on whether what the EU did was legally justified, but more because, for example, the US would argue that its national security tariffs were WTO consistent. And so if you establish that as the test, I think the WTO and the existing treaty mechanisms are broad enough that you can get away with a lot of what is in practice feels a lot like a trade punch in the face while still maintaining legal cover. But I think that's a fairly sort of, we can go back.
Yeah, and I would couch my legal argument with the other bit of it, which is it when you see it.
Yeah.
And that's much more difficult to quantify or justify in any sort of coherent way. But but I feel I've got a fairly good sense for it. But then other people might view it differently.
So what Sam means is he'll know it when he sees it. So if you just follow him on Twitter, he will just let you know when there's a trade war.
As I am the sole arbiter of how you pronounce certain treaties, I also want to have the role of declaring whether something is a trade war or not. So whenever there's a trade dispute, I will either tweet not a trade war or a trade war, and I think everyone should just go off that.
A whole host of like trade journalists gathered outside your apartment waiting for white or black smoke.
Yeah.
Like,
that's what I'd like anyway.
That's probably something to talk over with your zoning board. Okay, so before we move on to some of the like really concrete specifics, I want to talk about the politics for another moment, because right now, I mean specifically with the EU UK one, but also more broadly, it feels like politicians are talking up sometimes the prospect of trade war, or finding the concept of at least trade battles or elements of a trade war rhetorically or politically tempting in a way that, hopefully they don't feel the same way about a kinetic conflict. So I thought maybe I'd ask you, Anna, as the only one of us with any political savvy, why is that appealing? Where do you see that coming from?
So I think it's been appealing for as long as you've had any form of protectionism, right? It's the notion of I will put your interests first in everything I do as being the most fundamental political rhetorical tool in any form of democratic government. You want to be seen to be representative democratic government. You want to be seen to be, working for the people that voted you in. Now, it's harder to explain abstractly that you might benefit more from net total trade than selling your good to someone over someone else selling their good to someone. That's much harder to communicate. So I think it's always been a strong rhetorical device, right back to sort of Henry VIII, field of cloth of gold, even Henry VII, back to having rows with the Dutch. This is how a lot of the rhetoric around trade has evolved, about advancing your economic interests, the economic interests of your people over others. What happens is you get swings, right? So there are examples, studies to show that it trends with economic growth. So when everything's going really well in the world economy, you have narratives of openness, especially when you have very sustained decades-long periods of global economic growth. Narratives of openness become clear and easy narratives of prosperity. And you did see this for a period, pretty much up to the financial crisis. There was a bit of wobble after the crisis, understandably, and then there was a bit of a return to it, and then we seem to have gone back towards a more protectionist tone. I think what's interesting is once you start to get those signals of governments more and more saying, I need to put our interests first, I'm going to put our producers first, those narratives, it's not that people who say have money in the game, so people that monitor financial markets are really interesting to listen to on this. They don't think there's suddenly going to be a trade war, but they certainly don't think there's going to be more trade liberalization once governments start signaling we're going to put our own interests first, once they start adopting a protectionist narrative. So there's real world damage from the rhetoric of trade wars from the off. It will put investors off from the off. They don't want to invest in something where there's a risk. They deal in risks and they deal in rewards. So you don't have to have what, geeks like us might define as like, oh, there you go, textbook trade war, Smoot Hawley, if ever I saw it, back to the 1930s. You don't have to have had that, especially in a world where money's really mobile, to suddenly have like really meaningful economic harm. So it's important for us to remember that there are real world, outcomes here that also are invisible. They're not going to be a trawler stuck in a port or even a big container ship stuck in a port. Their money just not happening. And it's very hard to explain that counterfactual to people.
I think that kind of last point is especially important, both in terms of who suffers and how visibly there's a sort of after, therefore, because of link to some of these things. Because as you said, like an invisible investment, an investment that simply does not happen, or even one that's never even contemplated, that would have in a non-trade war scenario created a bunch of really high-paying jobs and revitalized the community. If it simply doesn't happen, you never see it. It doesn't appear on the news. It doesn't appear in any balance sheets. But ultimately, it hurts real people and politicians, and not politicians, rather, who instead get to trumpet this rhetoric. Sam, yes, go ahead.
Well, just to personalize it slightly. So if we think about Donald Trump,
Try not to,
but in effect, his presidency brought us back to this discussion around trade wars. It's not that there weren't disputes ongoing, but in terms of the pure weaponization of trade, he really did concentrate minds. And part of the reason for that, I think, is just the specific circumstances in the US, whereby he had won an election partly on the promise of dealing with the unfair practices of other countries who were taking advantage of the American people and the American consumer. And then he got into the office and he found that as the president, he had very few tools available to him to actually punish other countries and do things to them to get them in line. He didn't really have much of a stick, but one of the few sticks he did have was tariffs. So therefore, it's the whole if you only own a hammer, everything looks like a nail situation, which was all of a sudden every time another country did something he didn't like, or he wanted to change their behavior, he threatened them with tariffs. And in some cases they got brought in some cases they got brought in then rescinded. But in effect, this approach was born of the fact that he was actually quite constrained in his ability to use other levers of the state. So I think that is a big part of why we've been discussing it recently. And then, of course, once you identify that as the US context, you have to suddenly appreciate, well, that doesn't map on at all to the UK context. Why are we talking about trade wars in the context of the UK? And you have a completely different hypothesis sitting behind it. And it's all to do with the fact that we have acrimoniously exited a political union, and we're now trying to sort of find our way in the world and justify why we've done it. And on the other side of that discussion, we have people who are quite annoyed that the UK left and are quite annoyed by some of the things the UK are saying, and also having to justify, in the case of France, to their own political base that being in the EU is better than not, that France will stand up for certain constituencies in the context of fishermen. So I'm not sure there is one grand narrative available as to why trade wars have become appealing again, but you can point certainly to some different specific levers.
I think there's definitely ones where there's reasons where it escalates. So if we're looking at the UK-France row at the moment, we know there's an election in the offing, so we know that it's already a fraught political situation. So, and I think, like you said about, Trump's narrative going into the election, that's not to say that the grievances are the same or the reasons are the same or the morality of the situation is the same. It's just to say that once you've got a political imperative, either being seen to deliver or going into another election cycle, this political need to show that you are standing up for your people in terms of their economic interests becomes one of the ingredients that can lead to escalations in trade rows, for sure.
And I think that point, I think that came through in what you just said, Anna, but also Sam's point, that one of the easiest ways narratively to tell a story about how you are standing up for your people against Johnny Foreigner is this trade story. Because on paper, at a glance, it looks like a victimless crime when it comes to your own people. You are going to keep foreign goods out of the country, which will help your own producers because the guys overseas are dirty rotters. It's an easy story to tell. And as any political consultant will tell you, it's important to be able to tell these stories. But I wonder, sort of in terms of the UK, we've getting some comments here, but they're quite long. Do we think there's a master plan behind the UK's current rhetoric? I mean, if there is a master plan, someone's DM'd it on WhatsApp to Sam 4 years ago, and he's not allowed to tell us.
There is a plan. You can question whether it will be successful, but in respect of, so if we take the fishing issue as slightly aside because that's blown up as a sort of distinct from the plan. But in respect of, say, Northern Ireland, the British government entered into the withdrawal agreement, never being fully comfortable with the provisions contained within it. And it now believes that the leverage has changed slightly. The UK no longer has the risk, at least in its own mind, of falling out of an arrangement with nothing to replace it, of tariffs being placed on trade in general between the EU and the UK. So it now feels it can force the issue and force a reinterpretation of, in this case specifically, the Northern Ireland Protocol to be more akin to something that the Conservative Party as a whole would be comfortable with. So pulling out ECJ, European Court of Justice jurisdiction, vastly reducing the amount of checks and bureaucratic burden for goods moving from Great Britain to Northern Ireland. And it feels it can call the EU's bluff slightly. It thinks that if it does unilaterally impose some of its own approaches, that ultimately the EU won't overreact and that any dispute that follows will be manageable. And of course, this is a gamble, right? I'm not saying this will work, but I'm saying this is the plan. And so it's not actually trying to trigger a trade war. But as a consequence of its action, it could accidentally do so, of course.
Anna, did you want to take Valotti's question? If it's disappeared, I can sort of give you the gist of it again.
I think I got the thrust of it. It would just be very well. I'll do this really quickly, and then let's go back to what Sam was explaining. Just on this point. So someone asked about the tension that you can have in shaping regulations, and to what extent can that become protectionist. And what I'd say is that when it comes to slow-moving regulations, you've got different kinds of war. So I'd say tech regulation is a global cold trade war right now, for the most part, in that everyone's participating in it. Everyone's spying on each other at the moment when it comes to what they might do next in terms of regulation. Everything gets painted in a manner that's supposedly not meant to be seen as an act of economic violence, but kind of is. You have bifurcation happening. So, some developments of, cliche, but an iron curtain in terms of East-West divides with that. And so as the question asked, could it go hot in the future, basically, or could it become a trade war in the future? Absolutely. But I'd say it's one of those sort of like a glacial, trade tension in the background. But yeah, it could definitely escalate. And that's often how it happens. And it's a little bit what we're having here. And I think what Sam was trying to explain here, which is if you don't want to be pulled into someone's orbit for rules, but you've just had a big break with them, then that's when things get more violent. And so I think there's a view that with the specifics of this Jersey disagreement, this is happening because people feel in Westminster and Whitehall that the EU has been too particular over Northern Ireland as well. And so the UK is like, you want to do it by the book? We'll do it by the book. If you can't provide us with any evidence that you used to fish in those waters, having, by the way, never needed evidence quite in the same way for many hundreds of years before, but if you can't provide us with that evidence, then we will not grant you a license, because what it says in the text is, this is the text. Now, that's not the French interpretation of the text, but this is how the UK believes it's behaving. It's saying like, okay, if you don't want to be flexible, let's not be flexible. Let's be very precise about wording here. And you're dealing with very small boats that may have fished there for a long time, but they can't necessarily, because they don't have the same level, say, of GPS equipment, they can't necessarily prove I was there fishing before Brexit happened, therefore have a right to continue fishing on the basis of what was agreed under the Trading Cooperation Agreement. And so, if you think about the long-term problem being with the UK not liking the Brussels effect and not liking the political and regulatory orbit of Brussels, and that having been a slow-running thing for a long time before it got very tense, it is a different example to the tech one, but it's an example of how slow-moving tensions over regulations and autonomy do sometimes eventually escalate and become hot. So yeah, I think certainly those are ingredients.
And there's usually, my view is that before you progress from trade spat to trade war, a political decision does normally need to be taken. It very rarely happens by accident. And I think even with this dispute now between the UK and the EU, well, disputes on many different issues, at some point, the UK or the EU will have to take a decision as to whether they want to escalate this into trade war territory. And then in that moment, at least from an economic perspective, you can start to game out, well, who has more to lose? Who's most exposed to a trade war? And I think you could say, from an economic perspective, the UK is much more exposed to the negative shocks of a trade war than the EU. But of course, the UK could still do some damage to specific areas and within specific countries and the politics of it, particularly France in the case of fishing. And just to, because I can see maybe I've gone a bit too far ahead, but there was just one question there asking if France doing a go slow approach to customs would be trade war territory. I mean, I'd say no.
So it's interesting. I was about to answer it in the opposite way, in the sense that would it constitute on its own a trade war? No. But I think the question was, like, is it part of that same framework? And for me, if you think about the trade policy toolbox, you've effectively got legislation, you've got regulation, and you've got implementation. And if the French government makes a decision to use implementation of customs in order to try to cause the UK deliberate economic harm to affect a political outcome, for me, that is a trade, that is a jab thrown, that is a trade jab, and sort of, if it were happening in the context of a broader trade war, would be part of that trade war. On its own, it doesn't constitute a trade war. And if it were to just happen, in the sense that if there was no central decision from Macron, from the Elysee, exactly. If instead just some customs officials started tightening up checks because they just, that's what they considered to be due diligence. Not a trade war, happens all the time, levels of customs enforcement up and down. But when it is deliberately like, you keep our fishing boat out, we suddenly start requiring every single comma to be written in black ink and perfectly formed. For me, that is pure kind of element of trade war because of the underlying decision making. And then we just sort of, before we go back and forth on that, because again, we can get into these definitional debates forever. But there was a question from Smarty Puffin asking if there are any functional dispute settlement frameworks or bodies if someone retaliates beyond the TCA. First answer is you can cancel the TCA. That's not really a dispute settlement mechanism, but that's the next step to take. And then beyond that, there's the WTO. To the extent that is a functioning dispute settlement body at the moment, you can't take that all the way to an appellate body dispute, because the UK is not a party to the MPIA. So basically what the EU says is that if they sue the UK at the WTO and the panel finds in their favour, then if the UK appeals that decision into the void, because there's no appellate body at the moment, the EU has basically said it reserves the right to pretend it has already won, because the UK has not made use of the MPIA, and so basically that would be a dispute settlement mechanism. I mean, if you define the purpose of dispute settlement mechanisms as resolving disputes, I do not think that would resolve that dispute, but it is a framework towards moving in that direction. Sam, is that broadly in line with your understanding? Yeah,
and I'd also just say that depending on which elements of the relationship are affected, there are, of course, other treaties in existence. And I don't know in great depth what's included in any of them, but it is plausible that there are provisions within those. So I'm thinking about things like to do with fishing rights, but also aviation. Like it's plausible that there are routes you could pursue.
Okay.
Yeah. No, go ahead.
No, I was going to pivot us off into proper UK EU sort of trade war gaming, if you'll permit me. I'd like to kind of do this in a couple of stages. Where first, let's say we stick to I suppose what you call lawfare. So let us assume that things over the Northern Ireland Protocol disintegrate further. There is a real conflict, but the two sides decide to stick to strictly what is in the TCA, what is in the withdrawal agreement. Does anyone want to give us a sense of what that might look like? What are the options? Sam, Anna, I don't know which one of you's kind of looked at this more closely.
Sam, I'm happy for you to take this one. What I think we need to separate out is the fishing row from Northern Ireland.
Yeah.
So if we're focusing just on Northern Ireland for now, we don't really know what the outcome would likely be if Article 16 gets triggered in terms of the real ongoing scale of the trade dispute. I mean, Sam, cut in at any point if I'm not being clear. I mean, supposedly Article 16 allows you to override the protocol. That's the basic premise of it in certain circumstances. What's not clear then is whether or not all of the protocol gets put in the bin, or you just take some bits and you go, I'm going to ignore some of those. Now, legal experts might disagree with this, but I think once you get into the realm of triggering Article 16, it's going to be about damage control on either side. And so people will be like, well, we'll lock this bit off, or we'll try and do this. Now, people won't want to do that, but when they're trying to manage the fallout of the protocol going into like full-blown dysfunction is how I'd describe that, they'll want to try and salvage what they can. It doesn't mean that the UK, to be very clear, will be able to pick and choose what happens. Absolutely not. It just means that you will have a literal problem with single market management. That means people need to decide like an escalation route after that. So that's my basic understanding of what would be next if we go a bit further. There's also the Jersey specific thing. There are provisions within the TCA that are very specifically about fishing and waters. So with each of these things, it's up to both sides in a way how contained they make them. So if this is just about fishing rights, which, you know, one can argue politically it isn't, but if it's just about fishing rights, there's a very specific protocol to follow that was specifically designed for fishing because, by the way, there have been scallop wars in the Channel before. This is a known disagreement. I think, and I'm probably going to get this wrong, because Steve Pears, who was a lawyer, was tweeting about it, but I think it's Article 506 brackets 2, and this is the area that is looking at specifically containing within the dispute function of the TCA, that being the new trade deal, not the divorce agreement, which is the withdrawal agreement, but the trade deal that allows for some kind of resolution there. Now, with that one, these sometimes go in different orders, by the way. With that one, you first get sanctions, and then you have an arbitration process, which is, you know, that built into these trade agreements are supposedly ways to have bureaucratic safety valves on rows. So the UK EU, like other trade deals, have these routes, but it's not quite clear when it comes to Northern Ireland how you would then deal with whether or not you breaking using Article 16, invoking it to override aspects of the Northern Ireland Protocol. I don't think we are as clear as to what the next step is in an arbitration process after that. I think it depends on some of the nature, in what manner and how people interpret the invocation of Article 16, aka what comes with it. But Sam might disagree. So it really depends on how much you want to bring into these mechanisms. You can say it's a much bigger, broader thing with than just fishing rights. But so far, the official EU spokesperson, Nick Gutteridge, was reporting on this, has said, we're reviewing whether or not France has made the necessary notifications basically to the EU infrastructure. Basically, the EU is going like, we're going to have a conversation with France and get back to you on that one. So at the moment, there seems to be an appetite for keeping things contained and saying, if this is a fishing dispute, let's make sure it stays to fishing, and let's go and deal with the letter of the law here and see whether or not people have had unfair treatment. But it all depends if this becomes so fraught and you have a fishing row that's live with vessels in the sea, real people on them, and then you have Article 16 being triggered at the same time. I think it's going to be really hard to stick to the dispute mechanisms we have in the letter of the law and their interpretation. I think that becomes an academic argument versus a very live physical one. But Sam might have better detail on the next steps after invoking Article 16, because for me, I find it really hard to be like not disingenuous by just saying, and then this step, and then this step, and then this step, because I think the reaction is so strong once you do that.
So I think it is possible to map out different outcomes that follow the triggering of Article 16 within certain frameworks. So Catherine Bernard, so she's a professor, a law professor, has tweeted quite a useful flowchart that starts with Northern Ireland Protocol issues and then goes to Article 16 and then takes different routes depending on what happens. But I think what Anna said is fundamentally correct, which is that saying you're going to trigger Article 16 tells us nothing, or it tells us very, very little. What actually matters is what you do as a result of triggering Article 16. And if, for example, you trigger Article 16 correctly, and by which I mean the UK has a legitimate case that there has been either trade diversion or societal harm, and the changes that it has made are proportionate and address those issues, then you go down a route in which perhaps the EU queries the legitimacy of the action itself or the proportionality of the measure. But this is all actually quite contained. This is very process driven. But then you could have another scenario where the UK triggers Article 16, but is essentially political cover just to do whatever the hell it wants.
Yeah.
And it tears up the protocol and it's entirely unproportionate. There's really very little argument that what it's doing is actually to deal with problems in Northern Ireland rather than just to try and unilaterally rewrite the entire thing. And in which case you have the Article 16 route, which involves the EU introducing proportionate safeguards, which is something it can do immediately. But then the EU can also go the withdrawal agreement route and actually say, well, the UK is unilaterally reneging on its commitments under the withdrawal agreement, and you have dispute settlement there. The slight issue the EU has, and this is something the UK is very aware of, is that if the EU wants to proceed in a legal fashion and retain the moral high ground, in terms of its immediate response to any UK triggering of Article 16, and if we're talking about tweaking the protocol, it's actually unable to do very much because the safeguards have to be proportionate. And it would be incredibly embarrassing for the EU if its own safeguards were challenged by the UK and found to be disproportionate. So if the UK goes ahead with Article 16, and this is what I think it will do, and rather than scrapping the protocol, just changes how it's applied, the EU will threaten a lot of things, but in terms of what it actually does immediately, it might be quite constrained. What I do think would be, and this comes to Anna's point,
can I jump in and just talk the audience through what we're talking about in terms of proportionality when we're talking about trade terms? Because basically what you'd almost certainly be looking at is the EU would have to come up with a set of probably tariff concession withdrawals. So it would effectively have to work out how much it has to raise tariffs on the United Kingdom in order to rebalance the risk to the single market of goods entering it via the protocol not being implemented in the exact way the protocol is implemented. Now, that is a little bit like trying to quantify how many M&Ms go into the letter Q. Like it is an incredibly difficult thing to measure and a difficult thing to quantify. And so if you wanted to be sure that you wouldn't have this embarrassment of a dispute panel looking at it and saying these tariffs are wildly disproportionate, you would have to be fairly conservative, and you'd also have to undertake and demonstrate that you've undertaken some sort of study or research in order to arrive at the tariffs you chose. You'd have to be able to come to this panel and say, look at this giant sort of 800-page study I did that works out with lots of math that says this is how much we've done. Mm-hmm. And it's all really of that ties the EU's hands a lot for like an immediate sucker punch to the jaw where it just like bans, everything from Britain next week.
But the big caveat, so just to conclude, because this is where I completely agree with Anna, is that if the UK's approach to Article 16 is to just use it as political cover to do whatever the hell it wants, then from the EU side, all the gloves are off as well. There's no point actually trying to work your way through these specific legal processes, because it will just start putting tariffs on things or cutting off aviation and work out the legal justification later. So this is why what the UK chooses to do under Article 16 is so important, and also why there's a big risk element, because the UK might think that what it's doing is limited, is substantial, but limited enough not to trigger disproportionate EU retaliation. But the EU might not see it that way, and this could just go spiral out of control and go horribly wrong really quickly.
I think something that's interesting in terms of like what's the real impact of triggering Article 16 in a manner like, you know, that Sam describes, where it's not going to be effective, and is essentially saying, you know, if it's perceived as an act of massively bad faith and undermines other treaties as a part of it, is that we have to understand that Northern Ireland is an issue of global concern, that the peace process had a range of guarantors. Because of the Irish and Northern Irish diasporas, and because of the nature of that conflict, its length, duration, you had a range of other interested parties. So we also have to ask ourselves, what's really, really, really going to happen? Could have issues like Sam raised, and it really could get as bad as aviation. Aviation is always a really very hardcore one to go for. But you also, in all reality, you have von der Leyen picking up the phone and probably calling the US, and then you have the US calling the UK. We have to be aware that that's a very realistic route where this comes from, and that this is an issue where you have the trade agreement on one side and then you have the geopolitical situation on the other, and that if this starts to go very sour, other people will, be it very quietly, try and contain this because of the potential social fallout. So I think it's really difficult. I do think it's really important to look at the mechanics, because I think we actually could end up in the bureaucratic safety valve option. But I also think we have a bit of a geopolitical safety valve option where other people go like, this isn't good. Like, stop this now. Like, sort this out. Even when it was a case of, Northern Ireland Protocol stuff weirdly dominated G7 as a summit, because you had huge, a big group of the EU countries, and you had the US both going, can we just sort this out, please? And, when it starts to become a really big front and center issue on the UK's international as well as domestic agenda, that becomes quite politically toxic for the UK as well. So it's a sort of, we have to balance the flow chart with the who's going to pick up the phone to whom narrative.
In terms of risk, something that worries me more on the fishing side than Northern Ireland side, but really on both, is that my read is that over the last couple of years, you had this dynamic where both sort of negotiating teams were trying to keep their domestic stakeholders on board, and they were doing it in sort of unique ways based on their geography. So the EU was doing it mostly behind closed doors in meetings, Barnier traveling to every capital in the EU, having all those quiet conversations, assuring them of solidarity, building that. And then you had Lord Frost and others who were very much playing to the telegraph and basically sending those kind of signals to the UK domestic audience, which was much more engaged with the negotiations. And I think in the negotiating room, it felt like both sides kind of ignored what the other side was doing vis-a-vis their domestic audiences. They understood that they had to play to those, and it kind of sort of worked out. What concerns me is that now you have, on the fishing dispute specifically, you have French politicians very aggressively playing to their domestic constituency, while the UK, I think, politicians are going to play to theirs. And that's a dynamic we haven't seen before. And it is when you are having the same kind of jingoistic conversations at home, it is very difficult not to bring that into the negotiating room and to find a landing zone under those circumstances. And that's what worries me more than... I was one of those, I was like Sam, I was a relentless optimist in terms of deals getting done for the last 4 years. I still think that on balance, we probably won't quite get to open trade warfare, but that kind of dynamic worries me. And to make me feel worse about that worry, Sam, before you were saying that you'd kind of game this out and you'd thought about where some of the pain points might be for the two sides if we don't go the sort of administrative limited route, but if the gloves come off. If there is a trade war between the UK and the EU, what are the kind of tools the two sides might deploy, and what are we likely to see, and who suffers?
So I should actually say this. So what I've gained out is more of a proportionate response, because actually, insofar as if you're going full trade war, EU just suspends the TCA, right? And if you're going really extreme, you suspend the whole lot. I don't think this is necessarily going to happen, but so you're not just talking trade, you're talking aviation, you're talking haulage, you're talking lots of other things around justice and home affairs. You just really so that's the extreme. But if you're taking a more targeted approach, and let's say Article 16 is triggered, the UK overhauls the Northern Ireland Protocol, does a lot of things the EU doesn't like, but is still not quite towards saying we're not doing anything. There are still controls in place, but the EU wants this all to stop. So it starts listing certain products that are potentially politically sensitive, and they will hope will lead to those constituencies within the UK putting pressure on the British government to behave more sensibly. And I think the thing the EU has here, which is probably useful for it, is that the US has already made this list for them. In that, over the course of the Boeing Airbus disputes, the US created a list of politically sensitive UK exports that could have tariffs applied to them in the event that the UK, in the case of the Boeing Airbus dispute, didn't go along with what the US wanted. And there's a part of it, and so this was in a recent newsletter letter, because I just pulled a load of it out of one of the US documents. You have the Scotland list, right, which has on it things like whiskey, but also cashmere, other things that are made in Scotland. And then you start looking around the country and you think, okay, well, maybe we could have a red wall list. What is made in the red wall? And obviously one of the first things you start thinking about was, well, we put some tariffs on cars. Governments. Very funny. Freeports. You suspend the bit of the TCA that says that you can have tariff-free trade even if you create in a free port. To really go at them. But you see what I mean? You start to just get very strategic about this and try to apply political, and you don't actually have to introduce these tariffs. This is the thing I would say, that you just have to start talking about introducing these tariffs to start triggering some of the, well, hopefully from their perspective, triggering some of the political backlash. And that's what it would not surprise me if at some point over the next 6 months the EU publishes a list, right? Yeah. And a sort of naughty list.
I can definitely see that happening. I think the thing is that if we do get into, as I said, trade wars at the top, we do get into nuclear options. And let's be in no doubt about how extreme some of those options become. So, for instance, if you have a complete breakdown in trust, you also have a complete breakdown in administration. If you have a complete breakdown in administration, you have a complete, in the EU's view, open door to the single market. And one of the most controversial stories I've ever written as a journalist is the what if analysis that some EU countries have wanted to discuss, i.e. what do you do if Ireland does become, the island of Ireland does become a backdoor into the single market, and they become so distrustful of the UK that they don't know how to handle that. And all of a sudden you have both sides in a very, very bad situation where someone has to decide, okay, do we check goods that come from the island of Ireland into the rest of the EU? We come back to the same story, which is if you have two regimes that will not cooperate together, you have to have a border somewhere. That border all of a sudden has become very, very hard. And then things start to get very, very difficult indeed. And I think this is why you end up straight back at a situation where other people will become very interested in finding a route to de-escalation. But there's no doubt that if you go beyond the list point that Sam describes, and by the way, that can get very nasty in terms of social fabric in the island of Ireland and Northern Ireland in particular, and in terms of the UK's own internal cohesion, by the way. So if you had a Scottish list, that would be very interesting in terms of the internal dynamics of the UK's internal market. But then you start to you do have to build towards these what if analyses, and they even having the what if analyses for worst case situations here that go beyond the lists becomes an area of enormous controversy. It's hard to underestimate how serious things will get even when you have a list, because whenever you do these steps of escalation, you have to offer the what next, even if it's only at a technical level. If it's at the technical level, by the way, people leak those papers. Like all of those conversations can force and perpetuate the routes of escalation. So by the time we even get to a list, I think we should just be mindful of the fact that things can get very bad very quickly.
That's chilling.
Happy Friday.
Yeah, happy Friday, everyone. Some of you may survive. So in terms of just kind of to bring this right back, we're almost out of time, but I want to bring this back to kind of real people and real measures. So let's step away.
I don't know any of those.
Yeah, no. It's hard to see them from my ivory tower. Like, you got to really squint.
Yeah.
Eyes aren't what they used to be. But let's step away for a moment from Northern Ireland and the island of Ireland, because that's, I think Anna's done a fantastic summary of the worst case scenario there, or at least the journey towards the worst case scenario there. Let's talk about kind of the rest of the EU and the rest of the UK. What are we talking about for real people? What are the potential consequences? I don't know. I can.
I guess businesses facing, a very rather than say a light touch approach to some of the administrations that businesses might face when it comes to going about their commercial activities that cross borders. You get a very intense approach. I think that would be sort of the most obvious, immediate effect that you'd expect. And you're seeing this now with at a sort of a very particular level with checking boats licenses, for example, and making sure that you check every single one, as opposed to, say, 1 in 5 or one that you saw over there that looked a bit odd even. So there were just various layers of the rigor at which you can administrate things. I'd say that's the kind of the most obvious one, and often the most disruptive.
What about, so things that people have asked me is like, okay, on day 2 of a trade war, does the UK lose equivalency in GDPR?
Maybe. I'm sure there's a process, so it might not be.
I'm being glib, but
I mean, so we haven't discussed adequacy, but it's a good point to raise, because the adequacy arrangement, which continues to allow for the personal data of EU citizens to be stored and processed on servers physically located in the United Kingdom, is outside of the trade and cooperation agreement. So it's actually a point of leverage that the EU has that's independent of the structures created to deal with disputes within the TCA, and it's also a unilateral measure. So, I mean, there's a part of me that thinks that if we get to the point of the TCA being suspended, adequacy would have gone a little while before then, because you probably go there first.
So step 1 would be you kind of do what the TCA internally allows you to do. Step 2 is you look at all of the measures of cooperation, like adequacy, where the EU and UK have granted one another things sort of almost unilaterally or in a sort of friendly exchange that they can tear up without any consequences to the TCA, but which make it much harder to do business across the channel. And then the third stage is tearing up TCA. So you revert the trade back to WTO tariffs and you eliminate all of the trade facilitation measures inside the TCA. And then step 4 is you go beyond the TCA.
But that makes it sound like a slow process. And I agree with Anna that if things go really, really bad, so if it goes nuclear, I think all of this could just happen at the same time or very, very quickly. So I think the nuclear option arises if the UK's actions are deemed to be daring the EU to put a border up between Ireland and the rest of the EU. And I think in that circumstance, the internal politics of the EU and internal cohesion require the EU to essentially say, you've got 10 days to reverse this or the TCA goes. Yeah. Because otherwise, they'll be playing into the UK's hands.
So the logic there, to kind of put together what you and Anna were saying, if the UK puts the EU into a situation where its options are build a hard border between the rest of the EU and the island of Ireland, or build a border on the island of Ireland, the first thing that they will have to demonstrate politically, even if they're not sure it will work, is a method where they try to cause as much pain to the United Kingdom to get them to back down. So they open up and they basically hit the UK, or threaten to hit the UK with everything, in order to be able to turn around to their own constituents, and I think to the US and others, and say, hey, listen, like we tried, short of invading Brixton, we've got we threw everything we had at it. Is that fair, Anna?
Yeah, I think when it comes to thinking about how it all falls down, I think let's think about how it was all built up, which was that really until you had an agreement on Northern Ireland, you couldn't really have anything else. And that's why I'm so worried that if you don't have an agreement on Northern Ireland, the reverse becomes the case. That it's a structure on which, quite rightly, the people of Northern Ireland were meant to be perceived by both sides as the priority, because there was a very human element beyond plenty of other trade agreements. The human element here was so extraordinarily large. And so that's why I'm very nervous of it. It's also a completely academic point why I really hoped there would be a better agreement on financial services, so that there would be a really good bargaining chip that would be a good political proxy that could be outside of some of these other mechanisms, that would be a great way to have a row. That would have been bad for various things in terms of other forms of investment, perhaps, if it got fraught. But it would have been a clever way to have more tools in your arsenal if both sides had been able to come to a better agreement on financial services, because of the comparative advantage reasons of the UK. Now, in terms of long-term economic planning for the EU, they decided that's not something they wanted to do. They wanted to try and onshore more of their financial services, but I think it would have been very useful roundabout now, I think, to be able to have had more of a lever there, because that was the biggest economic prize. And once that got put to one side, it became harder.
Mm-hmm.
Sam, any final thoughts before I let you both go and thank our viewers, as well as plug your links, of course?
Zero final thoughts.
Zero final thoughts. I guess one for me then. I think something we've all tried to get across here today is this stuff is bad, and if it happens, then everyone going into it should understand how quickly it can escalate, which I think was Sam's point, and just how bad it can be, which I think was something Anna and Sam and I both kind of mentioned. And I keep coming back to that quote of, like, if you're gonna do this damn stupid thing, I would say don't do it for stupid reasons. If a trade war happens, then let's hope everybody does it eyes wide open, and not out of a sense of chest thumping jingoism, or to win a news cycle, or score half a percentage point in a French election, or a UK YouGov poll. Would kind of be the one plea from me as a trade nerd. In Switzerland, which will remain neutral in any war, and simply sell arms to both sides. I will sell talking points to both sides. It'll be great. So thank you guys so much. Thank you to all the viewers. Thank you, Sam and Anna. Let me plug your various projects and things. So with me today, we had Anna Isaac, our co-host, economics editor of The Independent. She tweets at Anna Isaac with 4 A's, 1 S. And she writes for The Independent, which is on independent.co.uk. We also had the Senior Research Fellow from the Centre for European Reform, who tweets at Samuel Mark Lowe. And he writes the Substack Most Favoured Nation that you can find by Googling Most Favoured Nation Substack or Sam Lowe. And I am Dmitry. I tweet at Dmitry Opines, and I run the little website Explain Trade. So now, with that done, thank you again so much for joining in. Thank you to all of the people who asked questions and joined us in chat. I hope you find this useful. I will, of course, throw the entire episode up on YouTube and perhaps try to clip a few minutes of Sam and Anna just scaring the absolute bejesus out of me for Twitter dissemination. So until we manage to convene this again, thank you guys all so much, and we'll see you next time.